We're here for week 5 of Hyperlocal, Out of Hours Hyperlocal. My name's Jerome. You'll probably know that by now if you've watched the other videos. And I work on the Creative Citizens Project, which is a research project of which we have another colleague today, is Andy, who some of you may know. I'm just going to fish out the web address so I can post that online. If I can just get that, let's just do that first. How do I do that again? No. Let me just do this first before I. This is the bit I always get stuck on, you see. Oh. No, it's not going to be in there. Okay, I'll find that in a moment. But we'll carry on. Andy, if you could introduce yourself, because I've left a gaping hole there. So yeah, if you let us know who you are and something about why you're here today, and I'll try and find this YouTube link.
Sure. My name is Andy Williams. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies at Cardiff University. And one of my research and teaching interests is in local news. Until recently, it was in the commercial local news sector, and specifically the crisis in the commercial local news sector. But now I'm very much interested in what might come to take its place as it declines and as the market withdraws from local news, really, and which is where my interest in hyperlocal news comes from. I'm also part of the same research project, Creative Citizens Project, as Jerome, and we've started that project. We've done a big analysis of the content of hyperlocal news in the UK, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Share some of those findings with you.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty good summary. If you could talk us through kind of what we've been up to then. So maybe we need to briefly hook this back to Dave's count, because quite a lot of people are familiar with Dave Hart's counting job, which kind of belittles it somewhat, makes it sound like in a big jar of beans or something. But could you tell us start us with a bit of background from there?
Well, this was the starting point for our analysis of the content, really. We took the count of news that Dave Hart produced at BCU along with Ofcom for the Communications Market Review, and we thought, well, we've got this sample of hyperlocal news here. It's 11 days in May in 2012. Let's have a look at it. Let's have a look at it in a systematic and kind of comprehensive way, and figure out things like who gets to speak in hyperlocal news. So we'd look at the topics, what gets covered, as well as the sources, who gets to define hyperlocal news. One of the other things I wanted to look at was the localness of this news. One of the big criticisms that gets made of the declining and crisis-ridden commercial newspaper market is that the localness of the news is being hit, really. The news is getting less local. It's more reliance on kind of cheaper national news agency-led and press release-led copy. How does this compare with hyperlocal news? The civic value of hyperlocal news was something we were really interested in relation to coverage of politics, local institutions. And one of the big things that we were also interested in looking at is related to the big research project that this is a part of, and that's how hyperlocal news as a developing cultural form is fostering different kinds of citizenship in the communities of which it's a part. So does it foster different forms of community activity, citizenship? That's in a nutshell the kinds of things that we were looking at. We also looked at uses of social media, we looked at advertising, we looked at links, and a whole load of other stuff too.
And I was going to say the interesting thing for me was that I kind of became more embedded in the whole area when I joined the project last July. But one thing I'd never done was a content analysis. If anybody ever wants to get familiar with kind of their area of practice or any area of practice, looking at a few thousand web pages about it is a bloody good way to do it. But it was really fascinating sort of working with you in terms of you having done content analysis before and having done that in a certain way, and that kind of shifting a bit because we were using Hangouts to do it, but and kind of seeing how I mean, in some ways, kind of designing and putting together the way the content analysis was done was almost as interesting as doing it in itself, really. Is that...
You're on your own in thinking that content analysis design is interesting, Jerome, but that's what I love.
I think what was interesting was kind of you were saying, well, we've got a basis of what we think we want to gather, and then we need to kind of wiggle that around because there's all the extra stuff that we were interested in for this project and for this particular piece of work, such as the creative citizenship aspect of it. Have you? Sorry, I was kind of I was listening earlier. So kind of how far did you get, Andy? I was sorry, I was fiddling around, kind of putting links up and things like that.
I was just telling people, you know, what we looked at. We looked at a sample of posts that were published on the openly local Hyperlocal news network during 11 days, beginning in May 2012. Yeah. It was almost 4,000 posts in total in the sample, and we analysed half of them to get to grips with, you know, things like who gets to speak and define hyperlocal news, what gets covered, how local is it, how and in what ways, and is it of civic value to the communities that it serves? Yeah. How does it cover institutions and local politics, but also how does it foster kind of different kinds of creativity or community activity, citizenship or community activity in the communities that it serves. I could tell you a little bit about what we found. Do you think that would be a useful thing?
Yeah. I think we've got people salivating and kind of wondering what the results might have been. Give us some ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, in terms of what gets covered, the topics of news. One thing that we found in similar content analyses of the local press is that there's very little voice for the man in the street, ordinary, everyday community members of the public in the commercial local news sector these days, compared with how they used to cover local communities. There's a declining, in some ways, level coverage of institutional politics. A lot of people have talked of how local newspaper journalists really get the kind of luxury of going and reporting local councils as much as they used to. So we were interested in this kind of thing for obvious reasons, really, and we found that, well, it was a very geographically focused, community-oriented form of news, hyperlocal news. There was a lot of coverage of local clubs and societies, leisure time activities, self-organized community activism. Community stories were the top category, closely followed by coverage of local politics, local government. Around about 12% of our sample was coverage of local politics, which is obviously encouraging when you come to think of the civic value of hyperlocal news.
It's interesting because do you what should I put? I was going to say, do you think that hyperlocal audiences expect politics to be covered in those type of sites? But then, having said that, I don't think audiences have an expectation necessarily of what they're going to find anyway until they see those types of sites.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to speculate about what audiences expect at the moment. I'd like to see a little bit more about what a little bit more of the audience research that we're planning to do throughout the next
Mm.
couple of years before I think about that. But it's obviously what's been indicated here is that the writers, the producers of hyperlocal news, think that that's what audiences want, or at least this is what they want to be covering, and that's got to be a positive. That's got to be a good thing. So there's a community focus. There's a focus on politics. Fair amount of coverage of sport. That was the third biggest category. Crime and business, local businesses mainly. That was the next biggest category. In some respects, this is similar to the commercial mainstream local news sector. In others, not so much. I mean, the focus on community is really something that's unique to hyperlocal, I think. We also looked at who gets to speak in hyperlocal stories, who gets quoted, who gets cited directly or indirectly. And on that, we found some similarities with the commercial local press, but we found some big differences as well. Similarities are the official, what's known as official sources in the journalism studies literature. So local politicians, business, the police are very well represented, and that's the same in the commercial newspaper press.
It's
but
interesting.
The big difference, and it's a really big difference, is the voice that members of the public and members of community groups get in this. You compare the source studies of the local mainstream press with the one that we've done here of hyperlocal news. There's much more of a voice for members of the public and members of people kind of actively self-organizing in their communities. When you lump those together, it's almost 20% of all the people kind of speaking in hyperlocal news stories are members of the public, which is just brilliant, I think. A big criticism of the mainstream news sector at the local and national level has always been that there's very little voice for members of the public. It's in that respect, it's not a very democratic cultural form at all. But hyperlocal is, and that's hugely gratifying.
It's interesting because when you say who gets to speak, just to clarify what we mean by that is when we were looking at the pages, we were kind of looking for sources, so directly quoted in quotation marks or kind of indirectly. But I suppose what we didn't get a picture of is kind of where those came from. So we didn't necessarily know how those were sourced or gathered. So I mean, and it's not necessarily of interest to the audience, but it's again one of those things that we can dig out kind of as the project progresses, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, that's a big ambition of mine now. Is the next stage of this project for me, the bits that I'm going to be carrying out along with you, involve talking to producers in depth and trying to get under the skin of this journalism practice. Coming from a discipline like I do, journalism studies, we know a lot about how the mainstream media news journalists work, and what's been found generally in studies of news and journalism of this nature is that the way that journalists work, their everyday journalistic practice determines, things like the independence and the quality of what they write. I really want to get to grips with how hyperlocal journalists work now in the next stage of our research. I talked in the beginning about how we were looking at the localness of hyperlocal news, because one of the main criticisms that's been leveled at the commercial news media is that it's become increasingly less local as its kind of deep crisis has deepened, and you just can't say that about hyperlocal news at all. I mean, the name is not a misnomer. It's really local, isn't it, Jerome?
I was expecting the same. The thing is, I was expecting possibly to see the same thing, that the mission creep of hyperlocal would be that they'd suddenly start talking about further afield. But I assume in mainstream media it's partly that there's an issue of not having the resources to cover the local stories, but also that maybe there's a thought that covering larger stories will sell the paper better or something like that. But I think in hyperlocal, I was concerned that there might be mission creep with people sitting down and saying, okay, what local stories can I write about today? Oh, there aren't any. So I have to look a bit further afield to the wider region.
It's just not the case at all. 87% of the stories in our sample had a distinct local angle to them.
87%, that wasn't it?
It's it's very clear, very, very clear. I think 83% of the stories overall. No, sorry, it was 87% of the things which sources said in our sample had a local angle, and if you look at the stories themselves, it was 83% had a local angle. When you look then, if the national and the international stories, most of them had a distinct local angle as well. So that's a really interesting and encouraging finding.
I think also there was a sense that where politics was discussed, again, it was local politics, largely speaking, wasn't it? There wasn't a lot of generic political wrangling about the state of the country. There wasn't. Do you know what I mean? It was focused around the stories, wasn't it?
No, absolutely. I was just looking up the stats on that we found, and we analysed each story, and one of the things that we looked at were any references to mainstream representative politics, at all. Government institutions, political representatives, councillors, MPs, things like that. And 27% of the sample overall contained reference to local politics. That is a lot, it's a lot. A lot of information that's being presented to communities by hyperlocal news about who governs them. That's what you'd really be looking for in local news, I think. We don't expect it to be all about local politics, but that seems very high to me. It's nice.
It's a shame really that we haven't got anybody here to throw questions at us.
All right, I can carry on dipping into the findings if you like.
Somebody did tweet and said about 26 minutes ago and said invite me, and I have, but they haven't yet. I'll just ping them again. Hold on.
I've been singing the praises of hyperlocal news a little bit too much so far. Not everything that we found was unequivocally good news, I don't think. And this might be to do with the way that we designed the coding frame and the way that we designed our study, but it might not be. And this is something that we need to think about and that we need to discuss and debate, I think, a little bit more. And that is sourcing strategies. The ways in which news journalists in the commercial media kind of work revolves around getting sources to talk about events. Sourcing the news, the raw material of the news comes from what people tell journalists, and that is conveyed in the news stories that we read by the words that appear in quotations. Sources lead the news, pretty much. So I've told you a little bit about who gets to speak, and there was some pretty good news there. The members of the public have a lot to say, and that's fantastic. But I didn't talk about how many people get to have a say and the kinds of things that they were saying. And for me, one of the worrying things that we found was that the total number of sources in our sample, people who are quoted in stories or people who are cited in stories indirectly, was a lot lower than I expected. And this is a real difference between hyperlocal news and traditional local commercial news. Almost half of the posts, the stories that we analysed, didn't contain any explicit input from sources at all. And only 20% of these posts cited secondary sources, more than one source. Now, why am I getting my knickers in a twist about this? Because studies of traditional news have been very critical of under-sourcing the news. People worry that without sources there in the stories, it leads to a lack of transparency about where these stories have come from. It can lead to a lack of plurality of in plurality in the sources of information to which audiences, readers of the news are exposed, and a lack of opportunity as well for audiences to learn about conflicting perspectives on issues. You know, if there's been a lack of kind of sources perhaps disagreeing with each other in news stories, then this could be a problem in terms of the quality and richness of public debate to which people are exposed in this form of the news. And if you think that news is an enabler of democratic debate, then that democratic debate, I think, needs to be reflected in pages of those news, in those news stories, arguably. Yeah. And we didn't see that so much in our sample. In fact, when we looked at the functions of what we call secondary source interventions, when people were, when hyperlocalists were citing more than one source in a story, why were they doing that? Well, most of them were there to add context. They were there to add further information to what the first guy who was quoted was saying. Lots of them were in broad agreement. They were giving corroboratory information. So it was about corroborating what was happening. And only a very, very, very tiny amount of the stories that we looked at, 3% overall, contained disagreement between sources. And this suggests to me that when it comes to this kind of richness of public debate, audiences aren't being exposed to a wide range of alternative viewpoints in the news that they read.
It's a shame that we haven't got anybody with us to give a bit of, say, from a hyperlocal, to give kind of an idea of why that isn't happening from their perspective as the people that write this. Maybe in because
we've had a bit of feedback in relation to this already from a number of people who've kind of looked at our interim results and commented on them. And one of the things that a number of people have quite rightly and interestingly pointed out is that my kind of lens on hyperlocal is very journo-centric. It's very mainstream media. It's very informed by the ways that mainstream media journalists work, and hyperlocal journalists don't necessarily work in the same way all the time. And that the fact that there isn't much disagreement between people quoted in stories could be seen as a positive thing. It could be seen as a rejection of the kind of he said, she said obsession with conflict that you see in the mainstream news media. Now, I think that's a valid point of view, and it's something that I'm really looking forward to testing and exploring in more kind of qualitative depth when we do our interviews with producers. But as somebody who is very interested in notions like the public sphere as an enabler of democracy, I do think that not necessarily kind of fake or forced conflict, but public debate and disagreement and dissensus needs to be reflected in the news that we read. And that's something that I just think is very important, because we don't live in a cozy world of consensus, and I don't think that I'll leave it at that.
No, we've actually got a question from Ali, because whilst Ali's ducked out of the live, he's watching us on YouTube, and he's just asked me on Messenger. He said, that's interesting regarding the conflict/corroboration. Is it because the blog format allows for opposing views in different but linked articles? I said, I'm not sure what you mean by that. But he said one post gives he said, but the next post gives she said.
Yeah, it could well be. It could well be, and that's something that our study design and that content analysis itself, actually, I don't think is a very useful tool.
But we did. Just to clarify, I think Ali's after the amount of detail that we got. So to clarify, what we would say is if in one story John made a statement, that would be considered one source, and then if in the same story Anne made a statement, that would be considered a secondary source. And we would be looking at how those two sources related to each other within that one story on that one page. And like you say, if John says apples are green and Anne says apples are red, then that's conflict. If they both agree that apples are green,
we didn't call it conflict.
Sorry, yeah,
but yeah,
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 yeah, oppositional. I think we called it.
Yeah.
So that might give an idea, Ali. If you're watching,
but one thing that we wouldn't have been able to tell with our content analysis is that if in one post, John was saying apples are green, and in another post, Jane was quoted saying apples are orange or pink or whatever, we wouldn't have picked up on that level of disagreement. Our unit of analysis, the thing that we were analyzing with any at any given time, was one post. So we weren't looking, we weren't able to look at the kind of just expressions of disagreement or dissensus between posts, and I think that's a valid criticism.
The other thing we weren't actually able to do, because we were just taking all the stories within this 10-day period. We weren't looking at the long tail of an ongoing story, where one story might be covered over like 10 to 15 blog posts, like we were talking about with Jamie last week.
Quite. We did get a bit of that. I remember quoting the Lincolnite about an industrial dispute. I think it was a trains dispute, and we did get a little bit of that.
But I wonder if anybody's done any research where they've taken one hyperlocal news issue and looked at how it's been covered ongoing across a number of posts, and how across those posts and the various sides of the argument have come about. Because Jamie specifically was talking about this last week, that there was an issue of some land being reused. I can't remember what it was for specifically now, but a park being reused to build something on. And Jamie actually opened it up for various people who had opposing views to actually write full blog posts to put their idea forward. So yeah,
that would be a good thing to do.
It was. But if you, the whole issue then became a bit messy. If you watch last week's episode, as it were, but we can talk about that later. I mean, people can go and find that on my YouTube channel.
I was talking from a research perspective. It would be a really interesting thing to track. It would be a really interesting thing to track, and it would give us some kind of supplementary insights that the content analysis completely missed.
Well, yeah, I mean, given that Jamie's researching this himself, he might bagsy that for himself.
Fair enough. I'll wait for the paper.
Ali says that it was kind of what he was talking about. He says that's interesting, as blog format often allows for each twist or comment to be covered over time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And another thing that we weren't picking up with our analysis was disagreement or dissensus being happening below the line. We were looking at the posts. We were analyzing the content of the posts. And while we did look at links in a limited way, we weren't looking at the content of the links in relation to the content of the article, which is another limitation of the way that we designed the content analysis. But I actually don't think we're missing a huge amount there.
We got
because they won that much. They won that much discussion in the comment.
No, we were able to code up the amount of comments, weren't we? It'd be interesting actually to look at which kind of stories generated more comments, and if there's a pattern, maybe.
Yeah, it would. It really would.
Maybe political story, and we can do that quite easily, can't we? There may not be a pattern.
But we can tell people, maybe one interesting thing to share with people now would be the kind of levels of interaction in blog comments that we looked at, and we found that in general, 71% of our posts, there was an opportunity to comment, but there were no comments at all. In 10% of the posts, there was no opportunity to comment. There was a kind of commenting where readers just talk in a kind of broadcast model. Readers commenting, but one way, in about 10% of our posts, and then there was interaction either between readers or between the readers and the producers of the news in a further around about 10% of the posts. I haven't done comparative analysis to see whether that's a lot or a little of commenting, or interactive commenting. So I'm not going to make any kind of value judgments about that. I'll just put that out there and see what people think, I guess.
Yeah, and the other point that Ali's just made is it makes him feel better. I'm not sure exactly what he means, but he rightly says the comment and reaction often happens on Twitter or Facebook, of course.
Sure.
It's very true, and I've said it before, that's what I see in WV11 where I live. The blog post goes up on the blog, but the reaction comes when that same blog post is pushed through to the Facebook account at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm not even necessarily sure how often people follow the Facebook link through to the blog post. They may just read the headline in the first few words before the read more link or whatever it is, and kind of form an opinion based on that. So that's quite interesting. But
it is interesting. A little bit worrying, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't even know how
of kind of context to our understanding of news.
I'm going to have a quick look at that because that interests me now. I want to try and find a blog post on WV and see if because I mean the other issue is that there are obviously on Facebook you can put out a 10-word article without having to worry about pushing it through WordPress and doing something that is proper.
Yeah.
And you can just pump out a little bit every so often. Just trying to find what looks like a bigger story that's been.
While you look for that, I could raise another thing that we looked at. I talked at the very beginning about one thing that we were looking at being how these blog posts kind of foster different forms of community activity or citizenship activity. And we found that 10% of the posts are explicitly calling for people to join in, to participate in local, non-political community life. So kind of apolitical civic activism, if you like. That could be local clubs and societies, it could be organizing or taking part in the stewardship of a local community kind of celebration, a fete or a party or whatever. That was quite impressive and quite high, I thought. These posts, 10% of them are encouraging people to become active members of their community. Around about 5%, it encouraged people to report something to the authorities. That was mainly in relation to crime or policing. So calls from the police were being passed on via the medium of the Hyperlocal blog. Around about 5% were encouraging people to take part in what might be called acts of journalism. Send in material, send in story ideas, what the mainstream media calls user-generated content, I guess. But then when you get down to the kind of lower categories, the frequency categories in this part of our analysis, you find things like formal political action, or even informal political action, kind of protest-based stuff, which again kind of squares a little bit. Which suggests that the forms of citizenship being kind of actively encouraged by hyperlocal news are not kind of overtly political, either in terms of representative politics or in terms of extra parliamentary or extra representative political forms of action like protest or that activism of that kind of thing. There's very little of that kind of stuff, but lots of kind of community life stuff. We also looked at whether these forms of kind of citizenship or community activity were real world forms of activity. Were they asking people to get involved in the real world, or were they asking people to take some form of action which was more web-based, which was more virtual, kind of clicktivism stuff? And we found that overwhelmingly 70% of these calls to citizenship activity or community activity were real world. So for for a medium which is very much kind of the web, and very comfortable with the everyday kind of networked interactivity of the web. It's kind of interesting to see that the kinds of activity that were being fostered and promoted and called for by these posts were very much in the physical geographical communities themselves.
Yeah. Ali's just linking to a big massive, I've just put it in the text there, big massive crowdsourced consultation response on design of a street. So the final wording of the document was put together using a group edit of Google Docs. That's quite interesting. So it's obviously a kind of a crowdsourced consultation that was pushed through. Just to give some context, Ali is the person behind Green and Leith, and he may well tell me otherwise, or that I've got that wrong in the text in a second, but I think that's right, Green and Leith, who I think were part of the, I seem to remember, were part of the content analysis. I even seem to think there were some of the stories that I did, that I looked at. He says, yes, that's right. So, yeah.
Ali also asked whether we looked at the types of media used by Hyperlocal, for example, text, audio, photos, video, maps. And yes, I'm glad you asked us that, Ali. We did. We called it multimedia. We looked at the uses of various forms of multimedia content. And let me just look up that finding for you.
It was overwhelmingly images rather than
it was, wasn't it?
Audio. I was kind of hoping there'd be a bit more video, because I guess there's possibly a bit of a hyperlocal myth of people walking around showing cameras in people's faces, getting vox pop at public events and things like that. But
it did happen, but just not so much. Not so much in our sample, and that might be to do with the sample. Who knows? Yeah. But it was 3%. 3% of the posts that we looked at included video content, and 66% included images. Videos were the next biggest category, but from 66% down to 3% is quite a sharp drop. Yeah. Embedded documents were in around about 1% of posts. Embedded maps were in about 1% of posts as well, and then hardly any audio files, so audio booze or Audacity stuff.
And also thinking about it,
and data visualization was they were next to no. But none of these. There's like 3 of them overall.
I was going to say it's quite interesting, because one of the things that came up at the conference the other day in Cardiff. Can you remind us of the full title of that, Andy? Sorry.
The Centre for Community Journalism's conference on community.
Yes, that's right. So it's communityjournalism.co.uk, isn't it? I think.
It is indeed.
Yeah. Good plug. One of the things that came up there was data visualization for hyperlocals, and the fact that the data is often out there, but it's kind of hefty and unwieldy, and people don't really necessarily appreciate what to do with it, but they would very much like to be able to. Yeah. And the story we saw was there was hardly any data. Well, it wasn't even really data visualization. It was often just a table of data
or a graph. This isn't a format for data journalism, is it? In our sample, there might be people who do this very well who aren't in our sample.
But I guess what I'm saying is
people do this outside of our sample period as well. But it wasn't a big presence.
No, but there may be the potential for it, because I think it's probably the case that hyperlocals have would have the nous and the gusto to go out and get the data and dig it out, but then having it in their hands and then doing something with it might be another issue. I don't know.
Data journalism is costly in time and resources and energy, isn't it? And whilst you can access different forms of data and different kinds of data as never before these days, it's often, when it comes from places like local councils, very difficult to make usable, as I understand it at the moment. It doesn't come up. It often doesn't come in an Excel spreadsheet. It comes in a PDF. So you have to figure out a way of transforming the PDF data into a usable data form. It's difficult, and I think that's why we didn't see much of it at all. It'll get easier, hopefully. And I think open access to data is a completely worthy cause for hyperlocals to be pushing. But it's tough, and it takes time, and it takes skills and resources, and that's I think that's the reason why you didn't see much video there either. It's difficult to edit video, isn't it?
Well, I'll come back to that in a second.
Relatively difficult compared with writing a blog post.
What I just wanted to show you quickly was I have, look, if I show, can you see that? That is a WV11. I've kind of just focused the window around the story. Mm-hmm. That is how, and I hope they don't mind me using this as a case study, but it's just something quickly pulled up.
You did sign a waiver about copyrighted material when you entered this Hangout, Mr. Turner.
Yeah. I'll just hold Google accountable for it. So this is a story that obviously they've written and then they put through, and then the text across the top is additional stuff they put as they link that through. So we have no idea, obviously, how many people then click through to read the story.
Sure.
And how many people maybe don't click through and are satisfied with what they see there and then comment based on that. We don't know at all, and I've also no idea how big the story is. Then if you go through it, it could be 1,000 words, it could just be the same amount of words almost. But that would be an interesting thing to look at in interview, potentially.
No, it would. I think that the kind of cross-fertilization between the blogs themselves and the various forms of social media on which people who produce those blogs are active is a really, really key area. It reminds me actually of one of the other kind of findings that we had, which was, to me, kind of surprising, but I think also might be explained by this kind of it happens on Twitter or it happens on Facebook phenomenon, and that's how the different kinds of calls to citizen journalism that were present. I told you that around 5% of stories were asking for some kind of citizen journalism activity in the audience members. We did a separate part of the analysis and broke that down into 5 categories. The categories were stories which called for comment. By that we meant largely kind of uninformed comment, just in the order of a vox pop. Experiences, which we defined as comment informed by either having directly observed or having some kind of expertise or specialist knowledge about something. We looked for calls to send in content, so audio, video, photos, the stuff that the mainstream media is telling us to send them all the time. Story ideas and feedback were the other 2. And we didn't find very much of it at all, really. 2.5% of posts were asking for comment, around about 2% were asking for informed comment, and around about 1% were asking for people to send in stuff. Send us your stuff, send us your photos, send us your videos, send us your anything, stories, whatever. I was really surprised by that, because it's such a big part of what the mainstream media asks audiences to do these days and to interact with them. But I suspect that the reason we didn't find so much in the posts themselves is that this is going on social media. This is happening
to a level. I'm sure I've had conversations with people in the past where they said, we did used to put at the end of every story, tell us what you think, and it got to the point where they just kept typing it every time and nothing was happening. So people
speaking personally, tell us what you think is one of the most asinine things that you can ask.
You know what I mean? Those kinds of calls that we were coding. I mean, in generally, not necessarily just tell us what you think, but or send in your photos.
That kind of thing, I can see value in, because it makes the act of journalism itself much more consensual and cooperative and collaborative and all of these things which one might expect hyperlocal producers as a community of practice to value. It didn't seem from the evidence that we were able to gather looking at posts alone that this is a very collaborative form of community news, community journalism. And we looked in a number of different ways for indications of collaboration between producers and the audience. And it could be that, this is just 11 days in May and we didn't see any of the stuff which is any of this stuff which is actually going on. Could be a sampling thing. could be that the collaboration, the conversations happen off-site, but they don't happen on-site, and that's something that we know now with some degree of certainty, I think.
I suppose the other thing we should give a bit of context is the type of sites we were looking at. A rough, well, I was going to say half and half, but maybe 2/5 of them were lots of the people websites. I can't remember. So, for example, I don't know, Bristol People. It's a
kind of franchise hyperlocal platform that's run by the Northcliffe Media Company.
Actually, do they still own it actually, or has that been sold? Have they sold it off?
Possibly, I might have missed that.
And then the other one, and then the other franchise, similarly, was About My Area.
Yeah.
So roughly half of the site, 2/5 of the site, I think, of the sites were those, and I kind of broadly think of those as being top down, because given that
a bit more top down perhaps.
Because their system.
But there's quite an open publishing strategy on the people site, for example. And they vary because of that. Some of them are very dominated by press officers for the local sixth form college, and some of them are very dominated by very active and committed community reporters. So it's difficult to generalize.
Oh no, it doesn't chat. But and then the others are, and then the other 3/5 are were typically WordPress or Blogger sites. I think I did actually a quick rough count, and I think it was something like a ratio of 2-to-1 or 3-to-2 of WordPress to Blogger.
I think it was 3-to-2 from memory as well. Yeah. Right. All right, of WordPress specifically. Okay. I see
of the more what we might think of as the bottom-up ones that are just
what we call the independent hyperlocals. Yeah, absolutely.
I think
there was a slight majority of those in the sample.
Yeah, but just to give a bit of context, because and when you start looking at the difference between those, they're broadly doing the same things the same way in the content analysis, coming up with the same kind of results, but it comes at some very slim differences, I think. But nothing. I was kind of interested to see if there was any difference in how the bottom downs and the top. What am I talking about? Bottom downs and top downs and the bottom ups were doing it, but actually there wasn't anything massive.
Yeah, I think that might be a bit of a blind alley for us. I don't think there's a huge amount of difference, was there?
No, because it's interesting, but I'm not sure. I don't think we've got any other questions from Ali specifically. So I suppose we might close with saying where next on this particular. Where next on the project and the hyperlocal strand of the Creative Citizens project is a bigger question, but what route does this lead us down in terms of how does this build on our hyperlocal research, do you think?
Well, I think that some of the best media and journalism research that I know approaches the media by studying it kind of holistically. It looks at the content of the news, but it also looks at the way that news is produced by interviewing the producers of that news, by observing the producers of that news, by surveying the producers of that news. And that's something that we're looking to do. And it also looks at the way that this news is, or any form of news, is received by audiences. And one of the main things that we're looking at is the value of hyperlocal news in a range of different contexts. So it's important to understand how hyperlocal news is valued by audiences. So we're going to be looking at some audience research, but we're looking at some in-depth kind of what I'd call, in my academic field, production research, talking a lot to producers of the news about how they work, about how they see the value of what they do, about why they do what they do, about what they're most proud of, about the challenges that they face. All of these things will be fascinating, and all of these things will shed light on our central research question, which is all about the value of hyperlocal news. And the economic value of hyperlocal news is another thing that we really, really, really need to try and understand a bit better, given the crisis in commercial business models. Is this a form of a cultural form, a form of news, which is economically sustainable? Should it be seen? Should we be asking that question? I mean, some people think, I know that you know, it's I'm stumbling now, but some people want to see it as just a hobby and are happy with it being just a hobby. But there are many people who want to make a living out of this. People who want to be journalists, perhaps, or people who want to be journalists who are being trained in journalism schools like the one I work in, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So it's an issue that we need to address. We need to understand the economic value of this news better.
It's interesting what you say there, because I think the people that are doing it as hobbyists are quite happy doing it on that level, and they may have an awareness of the fact that there is a bit of a magnifying glass over what they do. But I think people quite rightly take umbrage, and rightly so, when somebody says, "Yeah, but you're not doing your journalism properly," and they say, "Yeah, but I'm not a journalist. I'm a blogger. I can do what I want. I could stop this today and say this was just a blog about cheese, and then who'd complain about me? Well, the cheesemakers maybe, but
blessed are the cheesemakers.
Yes, blessed are the cheesemakers. But I understand why people get annoyed when they say, and also the bigger thing which I've heard said is that they're kind of failed journalists, or they aspire to be journalists, and people are saying, no, I never called myself a journalist. That was never the issue. I just on one level it may be a hobby.
I can see what you mean. Speaking personally, as somebody who's interested in issues of news and democracy and engagement, I don't care what people call themselves, but I care that communities continue to be able to find out in a reliable and informed way what's happening where they live, and a big part of that involves the roles that have been for the last century carried out by journalists. I
guess the issue is,
and I'm interested in seeing whether this stuff can replace this in some way. I'm less focused on what to call it and more on the kind of social and political and civic functions of this.
I guess it's interesting because, say we were going to say that as an example, one of the things we've talked about is the lack of kind of oppositional sources. So a lot of the time, for those oppositional sources to come about, it would require whoever's writing the story to go beyond whatever however it currently exists, and go out and find the person, do more research, pick up the phone, etc. And suddenly a hobby becomes kind of work. And becomes more than that.
Anyway, isn't it? It's work anyway.
But
what many are doing. With the sources thing, I did that because I wanted to be able to compare what an emergent cultural form with an existing and declining cultural form. There is no kind of agenda here. I'm not hitting. I wouldn't seek to bash hyperlocal bloggers over the head and say this is what you should be doing. But I'm interested as a sociologist to see this is what news has done for a century. Is this happening in a newer form of news? And whether you like it or not, it is kind of news, and it's very related to the news as a cultural form as it's existed for the last 100, 150 years, isn't it? Kind of
and if nothing else,
it's not like it's completely new.
Yeah, and if nothing else, this is what people are getting. They were getting this before. They're getting this now.
And we need to know that, don't we? And we need to know that if this kind of richness in public debate and the kind of disagreement and dissensus that I was waving a flag for earlier as having to be part of the public debate, which is reflected back to communities, if that's not there in hyperlocal news, and it used to be there in forms of commercial news, then maybe it's being performed in other ways, and I need to understand those better. And I think that's come through in some of the discussion and questions that we've had today. And I really value that, and I'll take that forward and try and explore that in the production research that we do. But it might be that it's just not there, and if it isn't, then we need to know that, and we need to do something about it. Arguably, I'm not saying that hyperlocalists should be the ones doing something about it. But as an advocate of, I don't know, the richness of public debate being reflected back on communities, then that's something that I need to take action about, I guess.
There's did you say I posted in what may be a final question from Ali, which was what we were talking about before. He'd be interested to see more case studies of new civic action stimulated by hyperlocals. So where something, I mean, the example I always come back to, because it's an easy, visceral one, is where we live here, there was a house fire, and it happened whilst people were away on holiday, I think. And WV11 were able to kind of, through themselves and through it didn't happen through any other means, rally the community into donating kits to the family because they just lost everything, donating clothes, and we managed to sort out using the church to drop them off. Similarly, there was a cycle speedway club which was gutted by fire when somebody arson attacked the building, basically, that they used for their clubhouse, and this cycle speedway club were doing their own thing, but WV11 were definitely helping corral people from around their locality to take part in the charity elements of it, and there was kind of companies offering services and things like that. So I definitely think, I mean, even just kind of within my environs, there's that kind of a thing going on. So there must be case studies out there. It would be interesting.
I'd still, and this is where my kind of normative assumptions do play, and I'd hoped to see more. I mean, I think that the fact that that kind of civic activity is being promoted is fantastic. But I guess I would have liked to see more political activism being promoted. I would have liked to see more political activism being covered, and I mean oppositional political activism here. Where this government has imposed huge cuts on public services that have affected millions and millions of people, and that really wasn't reflected in the news that we read, and neither was the growing opposition to the cuts agenda, to cuts to local public services, which existed at the time, and you didn't even see much coverage of kind of coverage of organizations and social movements on a very local level against planning applications, which people didn't like either, So there wasn't much political stuff. There wasn't even much kind of, this big Tesco wants to come in and close down our local shops and we're going to campaign against that. There wasn't even much of that either. I expected to see that kind of political activity reflected.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I suppose I would have.
Not much.
I suppose I would have done to a level, but maybe we'll discover why as we continue.
Yeah. It could be that the people who produce hyperlocal news just don't want to cover that, which is fine. It could be that to report on very contentious political issues as a kind of without the institutional backup of a news organization and a legal team and things like that might put people off. I suppose I'd be put off by being a kind of a lone voice in the community, giving voice to marginal or oppositional views in that way. It's entirely possible that the kind of precarity, the precariousness of hyperlocal producers within the community might be a factor in that.
Ali's kind of response is they crowdsourced objections to the greener leaf. Objections to. Well, I've lost my. Oh yeah, we crowdsourced planning objections on greener leaf. And then he says, "I'd like to find out more." I think he's going to type more there, but I don't know whether he's saying they have done that on one occasion or whether they do that as a standard.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. I know that it does happen, and I wouldn't want to give the impression that I don't think it does. But for example, which was fairly big and looked at a lot of UK hyperlocals. We saw hardly any of this stuff. I know that there are some blogs which wholly exist to do this kind of watchdog oppositional stuff, and that's fantastic. I love it. And I know that some blogs really do campaign a lot and stick their necks out and do a lot of this kind of great work. But in the study that we did, it was this kind of news was arguably underrepresented, and arguably there was less of it than you see in the commercial mainstream press, and there's not much of the stuff in that, to be honest. Yeah,
Ali comments he'd like to find out about other sites doing it. So if you're watching this, whether you're watching the video later on or whatever, and you are a hyperlocal and you have done more of this kind of political activism type activity or citizenship kind of civic engagement type stuff, then let us know. I suppose a good way to do it would be to put it in the comments of the YouTube video with some links maybe. That would be useful. Or tweet us. I'm at Jez Turner.
Well, I look forward to the comments in the YouTube video. They're always such a pleasure. If anybody's really interested in looking at an example of that kind of, very strident, oppositional, hyperlocal blog, then I can't recommend highly enough Jackie in Carmarthen, who runs the Carmarthenshire Planning blog, which is very, very kind of activist-led, strident, oppositional reporting of some pretty nasty and low-level corruption.
Yes. Oh, Peter Chapman, I think, is either watching now, but he asks, how can we comment as the show goes on? I think on a live stream there is a text box down the side and then it gets added to the comments at the end. Or, Peter, you can tweet me at Jez Turner and I'll get that, and then I can pose a question. Oh, somebody has... No, that's something else. One last thing before... So, 5 minutes to get any more questions in if anybody's got them. One last thing I was going to pick up, and you'd said this before, I think, Andy, about video, and kind of for a lot of people, video being a bigger kind of load in terms of work or cognitive load or creative load or all those kind of things. And actually,
it was supposition. I don't really have any evidence.
Yeah, no, but because my flip side of that is video being a relatively comfortable medium for me, on a kind of amateur level. It's probably would be quicker for me in some respect to knock out a story as a video as opposed to knocking out a story in words a lot of the time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you've got a smartphone, it's very easy to just take a very short video and upload it without any editing at all these days.
And 2 weeks ago, we had obviously our Blue Hyperlocal themed around video. And we had Dan from America, we had John Costa from Citizen's Eye, we had Franzi, who I think was in Germany at the time, or maybe in Birmingham, going back to Germany. But they were all talking about various experiences of doing video in that way. And a lot of it was very kind of quick, getting out there and just covering something. And almost being able to upload it straight from your phone straight to whatever kind of your sources. I'd
be interested in hearing more from people who do use video about whether it's a driver of audiences. Does it drive eyeballs to the site? I suspect that it does and that it would.
Yeah. Okay. Just responding to my wife, who burnt her hand and is now in...
Jerome, I thought that was another interesting comment or question from the wider public.
So my wife is no.
This is Wayne's World.
She burnt her hand. Or is it guitar? We need guitar overlays. We haven't even opened the effects box yet. But I think that's probably about it. In fact, I don't think there's any other questions. Hold on. Ali says, thanks for another great hyperlocal. Sorry I couldn't take part properly in the hang up. I think it means hang out, but hang up maybe is a better reflection. But no, it was great to have some questions, even kind of.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ali. Thanks a lot.
And I know people have watched this afterwards, and a few people have commented it makes actually quite a good podcast, by which I mean, I guess, that they're saying we have a good face for radio. But yeah, okay. So I think we'll probably leave it there, Andy. If anybody's got any other questions, they can drop them by us. And obviously, we do exist beyond Hangouts. We can still respond, and that's it. Okay.
Yeah, we both got our Twitter handles in the handy strap lines. So yeah, get in contact via Twitter, yes, or look me up on the Cardiff University website if you want to email me. My email address is up there. And if there was anybody out there listening, then thanks very much.
Yeah, there were. I can verify there was at least one viewer constantly. So there you go. Right. Okay. So good night. See you next week.